Welcome to Deschutes Public Library's online programming. Whether you found your way here via our web calendar or our YouTube page, you know that we've been busy producing online content. Since March, we have uploaded over 300 videos ranging from story times to history presentations to musical performance. There is truly something for everyone. I just want to let you know how much we miss you, and we look forward to when we can gather together again. But for now, please explore the engaging virtual programming that we are providing. We are interested in hearing from you. There is an evaluation survey link on our web calendar, and it will appear at the end of this presentation. So please take a minute and provide feedback about this program. Mermaids have captured the imagination of people throughout time and across cultures. We're going to dig a little deeper into the origins of mermaids and how they continue to be a part of our culture. I'd like to welcome Tracy C. Davis. She is a Barber Professor of Performing Arts at Northwestern University in Chicago, where she specializes in theater history and historiography. Please welcome Tracy.
Thanks very much, Liz. This is a talk that will reflect some of the background research I've been doing on mermaids. Then in about the midpoint, I'll be talking about my research directly, sharing some of the findings with it and some of the implications. This is heavily visually supported, so I suggest that we go right to that. The earliest instance of a depiction of a mer figure, and by mer I mean water, ocean-oriented figure with a fishtail, is from the 8th century BCE. It's in the area of modern Iraq, the palace of King Sargon II. And in this detailed image, you can see several important things about this figure. First of all, it's not a woman. It's a male figure, but it has what we now recognize as the classic version of the forked tail, the fluked tail. This is a form that recurs in various ways over time, but there are variants, and I want to focus on some of the variants as we go forward. Some of these variants are different cultures. We see this same basic form showing up in Japan, and there these figures are feminine and they're usually highly malevolent. They show up in Inuit art and they show up also in Hindu art. And this example on the right is from the Museum of Folklore in Delhi. And we still see this feminine figure, even though the culture is different and the number of arms that she has is different. She still has the recognizable mer tail. In the Western classical tradition stemming from Ovid, the creation of the mermaids is explicit. So this is set during the Trojan War, and Cybele is taking the Trojan fleet out to deep water and sinking it. And this is the verse. Now wondrous as they beat the foaming flood, the timber softens into flesh and blood. The yards and oars new arms and legs design, a trunk the hull, the slender keel a spine. The prow a female face, and by degrees the galleys rise, green daughters of the seas. Sometimes on coral beds they sit in state, or wanton on the waves they feared of late. So these creatures created out of the timbers of the Trojan fleet will go underneath boats, and they'll put a helpful hand on the boat to steady it in the waves. Unless, of course, the boat contains Greeks, in which case they'll leave it to the fates of the tempests. So this figure of the mermaid, which we know from antiquity, we also know through the Christian tradition. And here's an illumination from late 15th century France. And I want to call your attention to the fact that in this Garden of Eden, we have fantastical beasts, we have domestic beasts, we have also the beasts of the waters, and in the extreme left and right corners, we have two mer figures. On the left, a knight with the fluked tail, and on the right, a very commonly seen type of female mer figure who's a figuration of vanitas. She has her mirror and her comb. This occurs often in late medieval folklore, and it's the basis, for example, for the figure of the Lorelei on the Rhine River, although the Lorelei isn't accompanied with a tail, but she's up there with her comb, she's got her long hair, she distracts sailors with her song. Though there are many variants, I'm jumping back in time. Here's an example from an architrave from a Roman grave in Colonia, in now Western Germany. And in this detail, we can see that the figure is not human. The figure is a goat on the upper part of it, and yet the tail is recognizably the mer tail. Hippocamps are another common variant on this. This tiny intaglio shows a horse head and upper body and the tail of the mer figure, or the serpent ending in the fluked tail. We not only see this figure in hippocamps, but also many other kinds of creatures. And in this example of a Roman mosaic floor, there are male mers, there are hippocamps, and there's even this lion creature. It gets even a little more varied. This example from Switzerland has a elephant-like mer creature on the left and a horse-like mer creature on the right. But what I'd call your attention to is not the single fluke tail, but the double fluke tail. And we recognize this idea in the Starbucks logo, so it's still with us. I've not found any explanation for why sometimes it's single and why sometimes it's double. It doesn't seem to have particular significance, but it recurs often. Here's another example, and another. And here's a late example from a puppet theater showing various kinds of fantastical creatures with this mermaid in the center with her double fluked tail. Now, the idea of associating the female figure with water and with this aquatic environment happens in many different ways, not just with this figure with the tail. So this very famous frieze and 3 statues now in the British Museum of the Nereids are an example of this. So there are Nereids, there are Naiads, and there are Oceanides. And these are all respectively female-bodied figures associated with different kinds of water environments. The reigns of the Oceanides in this Greek crater are depicted as bringing down water from the sky, but there's another figure here who's associated with the well. And throughout Europe, female bodies, although in Teutonic lore they can also be male, female bodies associated with wells, with fountains, with streams, with lakes, with rivers. They're just everywhere. And they look like women, and this becomes a very important motif later on in folklore. Here's a late example, a Jugendstil bowl. This gorgeous Art Nouveau bowl is only about 10 inches high, but here we see a figure of a naiad gazing into the water. The naiads are irresistibly drawn to water, but they can also be fascinated by humanity. That's the Slavic Rusalka tradition, but humanity is definitely fascinated by them. So this basic form, which we see here in this 12th century carving, has been dated back to the 8th century BCE, and it's still with us in the 21st century, despite all of these variants. It's sometimes in the European tradition malevolently figured, whether, as we see here, as a kind of demon, or whether it's the vanitas of the mer figure with the mirror and the comb. And I think this gets replayed in something like Peter Pan from the beginning of the 20th century, here depicted in the film version from 1924, and all these mermaids on the shore drawing mariners to their peril. So is that because they're feminine? Is that because they're sexualized? Is that because they're of these two worlds? All of these are possibilities. Sometimes mer figures continue to be depicted as male. So that's why I emphasize mer rather than just mermaids. The mer is a merman, a mer woman, a mer it sometimes. So here are two examples from the Netherlands and from Russia. So we see quite a wide spread geographically and culturally. But this particular configuration of the female upper body, the long tail, and this fluke, a very cetacean-like fluke, seems to get fixed in our imagery by about the mid-20th century. And this is the form that in the 21st century, people who call themselves mers, mermaids, mermen, this is the form that they're adhering to. So a lot of this variation gets homogenized by the mid-20th century. There are two important sources, book sources, that I want to emphasize in homage to the Deschutes library. There are two books that really configure how the mer is understood, and specifically the mermaid, or this water figure, from the 19th century onward. And this first one is best known in the 19th century. The second one is best known in the 20th and 21st centuries, although it dates from 1837. Fouquet's Undine, based on an old folk tale, gets picked up and utilized in about half a dozen different romantic ballets and operas. And Undine, as a figure who comes from the water but has human female form, is loved or beloved by a passing knight. He's going to marry her, but he jilts her, and then his catastrophic demise comes about as a result of this jilting and the wrath that Undine's father brings down on him. And I'll describe that a bit more later. In contrast to The Little Mermaid from the Danish author Hans Christian Andersen, The Little Mermaid doesn't have a direct antecedent in folklore. This tailed figure who comes to land with legs and has sold her voice, many of these are inventions of Hans Christian Andersen. In terms of how we start to put a body and a scenography in the depictions of mers and mer creatures outside of literature and outside of painting and sculpture is something that has interested me for many years. And this is what I've been studying closely. So there's a change that happens from this, say, 17th century French example of these hippocamp-like creatures that are seen on the surface of water, to a focus and fascination in the 19th century with finding other ways to depict the marine creature in space on stage. And so we see in these examples of Undine and Eoline, both adapted from Fouquet, they take the water creature but depicting it still on land, or even better yet, in flight. The flight, the lightness and lift of the romantic ballet is emphasized in these works. Instead, there's this other thing that happens, which is a fascination with trying to depict on stage how the mer creature, the mer woman, can be seen in her own element, which is the water. So the 19th century stage is the first time when people tried to find a visual vocabulary for depicting the mer creature, not just at the breach of water and land, whether it's salt water or fresh water, and not just at the edge of a fountain, not just at the edge of a river, but in the river or in the sea. And Undine becomes the vehicle for this and sets a visual vocabulary for how to do this. And I'm going to first talk about the scenography and then talk about the costuming. So there's a concurrent fascination and scientific and technological exploration that goes along with this phenomenon. So this previous slide shows designs for drop cloths in which we can see this underwater environment. On the left, a grotto, and on the right, a kind of throne space. And even though on the right there is a pool where mer figures and hippocamps are frolicking, nevertheless, above that, there's still this watery domain. So we're submerged in this version. This idea of submersion is happening in people's exploration of the sea in various ways. So from the beginning of the 19th century, Europeans got very interested in going in the sea. They wanted to swim in the sea. They wanted to understand what else was in the sea. And from the early 1850s, with the consolidation of plate glass technology, it became possible to create aquariums. And these aquariums were little environments, like a little proscenium, like a theater proscenium, in which facets of marine life could be staged. So they would be built out with rocks, they would make grottos, they would include vegetation of various kinds, but the idea was to see these specimens of the sea. And this comes in part from the theater. So we have antecedents for this that come almost 2 decades before the first aquarium, which was in the London Zoo. This idea of the aquarium really took hold, and the scopic scale of this increased. So by 1867 in Paris, the aquarium allowed for these rather larger tanks. And side by side, you could have all of these different environments, like a multiple transformation scene of different versions of the sea or fresh water. This is used in scenography. So for example, some of the motifs that we see here are to have the coral. The coral is red. It's a Mediterranean type of coral. So even though Undine is in the Danube, and that's freshwater, we have these free mixing of salt and freshwater motifs. And the idea of the fantastical flora and its kind of outsizedness and the floating jellyfish on the top definitively show that we are underwater. The nature of the architecture can change, and this previous version has the figure on the top that's like the Brandenburg Gate, the rampaging horses and the driver with them. But here's a Mughal example, fairly close in time, that has different architecture, but many of these other same scenographic features. And clearly we are meant to understand that we are completely submerged at this point. Concurrent with this, painters are exploring ways to show what it's like underwater, and they're even figuring out how to paint while underwater. But this shows us that the underwater world looks completely unlike the terrestrial world because rules of perspective do not apply. The diffusion of light is very special. Things in the foreground can be in focus, but they will not be in focus further back. The dappling of the water overhead is all part of what painters tried to capture, but which stage painters had been capturing by this time for many decades. And then, of course, photography tries to explore this in additional ways after the turn of the 20th century. And this apparatus on the left shows how they did it. This, in another way, shows how they did it on stage. And this is a series of photographs of the scenes for Albert Lortzing's Undine, an opera in 4 acts. And in the last act, this large scene on the left, which is a palace, gets inundated. What happens is that 2 of the romantic knight's men foolishly tamper with the cap of a well. And this cap of a well is the portal between the Danube king's world and this human world. And this king of the Danube, Culeborn, is furious that his daughter has been jilted. So at the moment that the knight is about to marry another woman, Culeborn lets loose the water, and the knight sees Undine, this beautiful woman in this very special light, and he goes to her, he falls insensible at her feet. And they disappear through a trap. And there's 36 bars of music where the scene is chaos. Furniture is flying everywhere. The chorus is running around. And symbolically, water is coming in. There's no real water. Let's be clear about that. The stage is not being inundated with water, but the story is that it's being inundated with water. And gradually, the setting is changing to this final version of Culeborn's throne under the water, under the Danube. And I have very little faith that the Danube's bottom really looks like this. The point is that this is, by this time, the version of what this must look like. And then modernist scenographers interpret this in new vocabularies, but they maintain this idea of the throne or the belvedere, and they utilize this additional idea of lighting and the strangeness of the creatures to keep bringing Undine's realm into view. But what does Undine herself look like? I started off with the body, and so I want to pick up with the body. There's a folklorist named Jakob Grimm, who in the 1830s published a collection of astonishing research across Northern Europe of many manifestations of folklore. And he describes how these Meerwunderen, these women of water, can be recognized on land because the hems of their skirts will be wet, or the tips of their aprons will be wet. So Undine here, as a female figure in this costume design, is depicting that idea. And that idea recurs here half a century later, where we have the version of Undine as a fisher folk's daughter, really foster daughter, who's not known to be a water spirit. But if you look at the tips of her skirt, or the bottom of her skirt, it's a darker green. If you look at the ends of her scarf, they're kind of textured, so it's like dripping water off them. And then at the end of the opera, when she manifests fully as her true self, we see some of these elements that are recognizable from the scene designs, the coral in her hair and around her armlets and around her waist. There's a a kind of eel or fish-like creature circling her calves, and around the hem of her garment are sewn shells. Her long water drips like water or like weeds. So she's very recognizably of the water, but she's in this long tradition that goes back to the Naiads and the Oceanides, not to these mermaid figures of the forked tail. But there's another operatic tradition that is concurrent with this, and this comes from Wagner. So I have two costume designs here of characters from the Ring cycle. First, Brunhilde, and Brunhilde is this figure of martial womanhood. She's a formidable woman, and she is associated with flight. She has a horse that she flies on. Let's contrast this with what the Rhine daughters look like. And these three Rhine daughters have essentially the same skirt, but they pick up some of these maritime motifs from Undine. They have the coral around the waist for the Rhine daughter on the right. They have the flowing manes, the kind of dripping vegetation around their girdles. They're very much in the water, and Das Rheingold crucially has the Rhine daughters in the water because the gold is submerged in the water, and we see that depicted at the back of this costume design. What's interesting about Das Rheingold that's very different from Undine is that the Rhine daughters, they swim. So there are mechanics that support this swimming, and this drawing from Lautenschläger shows us how this was done. They're strapped into these contraptions, and they're flying through the space. Here are two examples. On the left, what it looks like from the audience perspective. So here they are inundated. You can see the striations across a strim, which would be downstage from the singers. You see that showing that they're submerged in water, and these stagehands in the illustration on the right, this would be a picture from the wings, are working these machines to be able to lift the Rhine daughters up and down, and they're singing the whole time. This example from the 1920s shows very literally the idea of the banks of the Rheingold rising from it, and the three Rhine daughters swimming around it. And here, in contrast to here with skirts, and here with kind of skirty things, a little bit more on the right from the Bucharest example, a bit of a fluke. Here, they're definitely that now classic mer figure, classic in terms of its homogenization. So there are things that happen in the 20th century that help explain this standardization. And one of the remarkable performers who helps bring this about is an Australian swimming phenomenon named Annette Kellerman. She was a woman swimming when women didn't generally swim. She swam distances, she set all kinds of records. Then she started to do exhibition swimming and was picked up in the films. And Queen of the Sea is one of her films. And here she had to train her chorus of other mermaids to swim. And what's special about swimming in this costume is that you have to swim with your arms. And Kellerman describes how this all comes from the arms. And this caption on the bottom of the still on the right emphasizes this, how it's coming from the upper body. The legs are encased. In our times, we're getting more and more interested in mermaids. So this Ngram viewer from Google Books shows the idea taking off after 1980, but we might say even particularly after 2000. And this is borne out in the work that I've done and work that I've done alongside with colleagues, Sarah Malu-Strandvand at the University of Groningen and Megan Dunn, who's a freelance art researcher who's done fantastic work interviewing contemporary mermaids. We can now say that mermaids are not just figures of folklore and figures of these kinds of fantastical visions of the other world, but there are people who describe themselves as mermaids and mermen. It's their identity. Performatively, one antecedent for this comes from Weeki Wachee, the famous freshwater springs in Florida that's had a fantastic set of performances that have been happening since 1947, although sadly during the pandemic they are not able to perform. But what's interesting about the Weeki Wachee mermaids is that they use this basic idea of the encased lower body and the fluked tail. They have breathing apparatus. So along the sides and hidden behind some of the scenery are oxygen tubes, and they swim over to them, they'll breathe out through the oxygen tube and then go back and continue the performance. They don't have to surface to breathe. I'm interested in both how this has become a widespread phenomenon of sometimes the gatherings of a few, sometimes the gatherings of many on an amateur basis, using this basic form and format of this tale to, this wonderful slide is from the California Mermaid Convention in pandemic times, unable to gather in person, but still expressing their identities in this way. And these mermaid conventions, which are happening in many parts of the world, in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, there's a large one on a competitive basis in Egypt. There are mermaids who teach mermaiding, who perform as mermaids in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in Australia. This is truly a worldwide phenomenon. They have adopted this form, but they've also adopted techniques that come from free diving. And this has enabled them to take Annette Kellerman's idea of the swimming mermaid to literally new depths. So free diving is a physical discipline of apnea swimming that allows one to hold one's breath, or rather to be without breath for long periods of time. Those periods can be up to several minutes. The record for static apnea, just sitting on the bottom of a pool, is something like 11 minutes. It's quite alarming to hear, but it is a discipline. People train for this. I want to emphasize to any listeners, don't just go out and try this on your own, but find somebody certified in apnea techniques and learn from them. But many mermaids over the last decade have received this training, and it enables them to improve the idea of submersion, with the fact of submersion, with a lengthy submersion, and to realize in a performative way what artists and writers have been depicting for millennia. Now, some are amateur, many thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. There isn't a census on this, but many are amateur mermaids, but there are some professional mermaids, and Lyndon Walbert is one of these out of California, and she's diversified from entertainments for children to a line of merchandise. She's not the only one with this. I'm not endorsing anyone in particular, but I'm showing how this idea of a particular form has been taken up and made feasible. So children can buy pre-made tails, adults can buy pre-made tails. If you are willing to sink over $5,000 into a silicone tail, you might have one made specially for you. There are a couple of restaurants in the United States where mermaids perform regularly. The Dive Bar in Sacramento, California, and the Rec Bar in Sarasota, Florida. And it's like a large aquarium window into a pool area, and the mermaids perform there. But the apnea training, the breath holds, allow them to not only display extraordinary physical feats, but also, if they're interested in that, different aspects of the mythological underpinnings of the mer creature. Here's one we see with a mirror and drawing attention to her hair. So this is the vanitas. This is the medieval vanitas brought into the 21st century. There are instructors, and this is becoming a little bit more regularized in recent years. About 6 years ago, when I started researching this, there was no organization. Anybody who was allowed to teach swimming could teach mermaiding. So it's becoming a little bit more regularized, and I think that's a good thing. But basically what children are taught is the dolphin kick. So Annette Kellerman's focus was on the upper body. Now we recognize that propulsion for the mermaid comes from the lower abdomen, and that beautiful kind of gliding movement is achieved by perfecting the dolphin kick and being submerged at the same time. Claire Lesserine, who is a French exponent of this, performs regularly at the Paris Aquarium, although again, in pandemic times, that's not happening. But here she's pictured in a giant aquarium that you can walk all the way around. It's absolutely enormous. I can't remember how many liters of water there are. It's about 2 to 3 stories high, sitting in the middle of a mall. And she performs here. So here, being submerged and being able to manage the breath holds is as important as how she locomotes and how she brings different facets of the mythology to this. And Claire Baudet, who is Claire Lesserine, is a scholar of this history. So I want to end by looking briefly at another new manifestation of the mermaid. This is Hannah Fraser, known as Hannah Mermaid. She is one of the pioneers of this new phase of professionalism after about 2008. She works out of California, originally Australian. She not only is really interested in working with the form of the body, you can see in these 3 different illustrations, she's working with different flukes and different fin motifs, different colors, but she is, and she has a line of merchandise that she promotes, but she's particularly invested in using mermaiding as an activist, to use the sum total of these techniques and aesthetics to be able to be filmed underwater and bring that footage to call attention to the plight of our oceans. So we see an activism here that's drawing us into what's broadly understood as marine and oceanic conservation, preservation. She has made presentations, or her film, how she's been filmed has been shown at various gatherings where policymakers are debating how to bring about new policy. Sometimes that can be fishing policy, as with a single nation, as she worked with Australia, or sometimes it's multinational organizations and NGOs that are capable of preserving particular waters, particular waterways, and we hope species. So she's depicted here with whales on the left and with dolphins on the right, but she's also been photographed with crocodiles and any number of creatures that face different sorts of human threats. So that brings us full circle on this quick tour of many millennia of mermaiding and where we are at the moment.
Thank you, Tracy. Just really enjoyed that. Beautiful, beautiful images. Really an interesting history. So I just have a couple of questions. I'm wondering, at the beginning, you talked a little bit about the association between women and water. And I'm wondering, you know, in the naiads and why is it, and I'm wondering why is it that throughout history, women and water have shown up in various ways. What's the association there? Is there any scholarship about that, or?
There is scholarship on that. I can't cite it directly, but in general, if we think about this as a worldwide phenomenon, if we think about how this association is not just European in origin, but we see it in West Africa, we see it in the Philippines, we see it in Japan. It could be something as simple as women are associated with the moon, and the moon is associated with the tides. It could be something as simple as that if we think as kind of cross-cultural anthropologists. It might also be that in many cultures, women are kind of otherworldly, or their ability to reproduce and to bring new life in the world makes them uncanny. And perhaps that uncanniness helps the association with these mythical creatures, or with an idea of the hybridness of the mer.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that. The idea that females, women, the mysteries that our bodies hold, and the mysteries that waterways hold. I think that's a really interesting idea. I'm going to have to think about that.
Yeah, the vanitas takes us in another direction, though, of course, right? Because the woman as vain, or the woman as malevolent, the woman as threatening. That European tradition specifically threatens mariners. So that's the conflict. That's the conflict between two facets of the world, right?
Interesting. I'm going to have to think about that. I'm really interested in that whole idea of the conflict that's played out in these mer figures. Interesting. So I'm wondering about the opera Undine. Is it still being performed and staged? And have you been able to see it?
I've never seen it. Undine has been very much part of the Germanic tradition, not much done in other nations. And the research I've done on this suggests that it was still in the repertoire into the 70s and 80s. It might still show up, but it's not being done as often as it was even in the middle part of the 20th century. There's a play by Undine, there's a play by Jean Anouilh that started to be produced a lot in the late 1940s and 1950s. But even that has fallen out of the repertoire in France and Germany.
So my last question, when you were talking about mermaids now, and you mentioned people teaching mermaiding, and I'm wondering, besides learning how to use your torso to for propulsion and holding your breath. What other kinds of things are they teaching for mermaiding?
Well, so what do you think mermaids do? Mermaids frolic underwater. So one training technique is to be able to swim through a hoop. So to be able to swim on a particular trajectory. Another training technique is to put weighted objects, weighted starfish, weighted shells, things like that, on the bottom of a pool. And the mermaids will swim and pick them up and bring them up to the surface. Just the idea is to try to keep the fledgling mermaid underwater and graceful. Other things that they're taught, in some of these courses, they're explicitly taught about the ocean, and there's a message about ocean conservation. There's a really interesting mermaid who works out of Halifax in Nova Scotia, Raina Mermaid, and she's been an advocate for even just paying attention to what you wear in the water. Make sure that you don't wear any materials that will leave any residues in the water, or don't use materials that have sequins, because the sequins can come off and then imperil sea life. So it goes, it covers the gamut from how to move as a mermaid to how to think as, I don't want to say think as a mermaid, but how to be conscientious about what you do as an advocate of the water.
Right. Well, I know that you and I, when we spoke on the phone, when we were making arrangements for today's presentation, I think I shared with you that, the Deschutes River that goes through Bend, I don't think she was out this summer, but we do have a mermaid regularly swimming in the Deschutes, to the delight of all the people who get to see her work. So we have Central Oregon mermaids, even in spite of being in the middle of the high desert. So
there are, as I said, there are mermaids everywhere, and many landlocked mermaids.
yeah,
And when you do see one, it brings a new consciousness, doesn't it? It's not that you don't recognize what she is, but you think again about where she is.
it's just I have been captivated by mermaids, especially in my childhood. So it's been really interesting to talk with you today about this really interesting topic. I have a lot to think about, and going to make sure that our library has plenty of mermaid materials available.
That's great, Liz. And just to note that on the references list, I've included some podcasts. If people really do want to find out more about contemporary mermaids and mermaiding, those podcasts are a great place to start.
Perfect. And thank you for reminding me to remind people that Tracy's resource list, there's a PDF link on the calendar website, and then we will also put the PDF link at the end of this program. And don't forget to fill out the survey. And thank you, Tracy, very much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.